state and in other places. All right, so we'll get started here. So kind of what's interesting about birds, and especially migratory birds, most of the species that we deal with as a wildlife agency, whatever we do only impacts New York and New York's residents. So obviously wildlife are a public resource that we're managing and public trust for everybody. And with migratory game birds, especially, what we do in New York has far-reaching implications for a whole bunch of other states and other countries even. So you can see, these black lines, this kind of shows biological flyways. And so a lot of these projects that I'm going to be talking about are collaborative efforts. New York is the lead on some of them, and for some, we're just a collaborator. But we're all kind of trying to work together because it's really great when you can do a small scale study and learn something about, say, how ducks are using Montezuma National Wildlife Refuge. But it's a lot more powerful when you can look at it on a landscape level. So kind of how we operate from a regulatory role and from a collaborative role often are in these administrative flyways. So we're in the Atlantic Flyway. New York's kind of in the heart of it. We're pretty unique in the flyway in that almost every species that outside of whistling ducks of migratory game birds come through New York or winter in New York or breed in New York. So we're a really important state in the flyway for pretty much every species. We have probably the most diverse habitats of any state in the East, between the Great Lakes, the Mount Adirondacks, Catskills, Finger Lakes, and then obviously Long Island is very unique. All right, so jumping right into it, one of the species that we're working with, it's one of the most common ducks that we have. So it's a species that's been studied a lot, especially out west. Their populations are very different out west, though, than they are like in a prairie landscape. They're very different. Mallards in the Northeast and throughout Eastern Canada are relatively new to the area. They've only been here. There's some books from like the 40s where they're talking about breeding birds of New York. They don't even mention mallards. So it's really interesting. It was black ducks, even like that, like they were just considered a migratory bird that passed through, but there were no breeding birds. And obviously in 70, 80 years, we've come a long way to where they're just ubiquitous across the landscape. So they got here basically from game farm releases and then some westward immigration from wild mallards out west is really how we think their populations got started, and genetics really support that a lot of the birds we have are of kind of game farm origin, but they're wild birds at this point. They've been here for a long time. But what's happened is, so throughout the 70s, 80s, I should have put this table in here that goes way back further, but throughout the 70s, 80s, 90s, they really exploded in terms of numbers. And they hit this peak of about 1.4 million birds in the Eastern Canada and the Northeast US. And we do a lot of surveys, the maps that I showed you here. These are all the surveys. So each one of these lines is a transect survey. Each one of those little squares is a plot survey that's flown by a helicopter. Each of these are all ground-based surveys that we do. So we survey all these areas every single year to monitor duck populations. And all those surveys are really geared towards counting mallards because they're our number one harvested duck. And they're really important in the flyway. So can you guys hear me? Okay. So the concerning part is that for a period of about 20 years in the early 2000s, we started to see this really consistent but really slow decline. And we don't have a lot of explanations as to why that decline is happening. We don't believe that it's harvest related, although we did make changes to harvest regulations in 2018 just to make sure. And I'm going to talk about our concerns about them, but keep in mind that we still have over 1 million breeding mallards, so it's not like the species is in any way, shape, or form at risk. Just whenever we see long-term declines, we want to know what's going on. And the other unique thing that we're kind of seeing is those birds that are in the Northeast US or breeding there are the ones that are declining. The ones in Canada are really staying stable to even slightly increasing. So this is kind of where we started in 2018. New York and myself and a biologist from Pennsylvania We started to put together a proposal and reached out to a couple academics and then the rest of the flyway to see if folks were interested in exploring these questions of what's going on. In the meantime, just to bring us up to speed to where we are, this is kind of that same graph. Blue line is Northeast, red line is Eastern Canada. We had 3 years of no data from COVID. And then this year or 2 years, we had no data from COVID. And then we finally did another full survey this year, and we saw a pretty big increase in Canada, but still pretty stable to declining populations in the Northeast US. So there's still something going on that we're trying to figure out. So what we did was 22 different agencies and NGOs. We all got together and decided to put together an extremely large telemetry study to try to learn what's going on with eastern mallards. There's a lot of new technology that gives us new insight and lets us research birds in a way that we never have. And a lot of my presentation is going to be going over what are some of these new techniques that we have to study ducks and birds and even mammals and things like that. So this duck here, you can see she has a transmitter in the middle of her back. It's got a little solar array on it. And we plan to put over 1,200 of these out on female mallards, only females, because they're really the ones that drive populations over the next 4 years. So far, in just 2 years, we've deployed 610 transmitters, and starting this year, we just deployed 400 geolocators. I'm going to talk a lot about GPS transmitters and geolocators. GPS transmitters give us really fine scale data. Every hour, they're giving us a point that's within, 25 meters or so of where the bird actually is. Geolocators are a much simpler technology that's about 1/10 of the price of a GPS transmitter. But they don't transmit any data, so they store it all on board. So you have to actually get it back, which means you don't get a lot of the data because the bird, no one ever encounters the bird again after you let it go sometimes. And what they do is all they do is record sunlight. And from that sunlight, you can tell sunrise and sunset. And from sunrise and sunset, you can actually estimate where that bird is. The other thing we can learn with them is we can learn about nesting because it's on a leg band. And when the bird sits down on a nest, it goes pitch black for all parts of the day. So you can actually see when it was nesting. So we'll really get into the details there. And I do apologize. There are going to be times where I kind of get into the weeds and probably go into a little too much detail on the technology, but hopefully it's not too boring. So these are all the partners. It's pretty much every state north of Georgia in the Atlantic Flyway is part of this. And then the maritime provinces, Ontario, Quebec, are all involved and all putting out transmitters and geolocators. The 2 universities we're working with are SUNY Brockport, Jake Straub, and Dr. Mitch Wiegman from University of Saskatchewan. And then John Clusie from Ducks Unlimited are kind of the kind of core collaborators are myself, Nate Huck, and then those 3 people. And then we have a lot of partners on this project. So here's a really long-winded slide that tells you kind of all the things we're hoping to learn from this project. And the amazing part about this is we're gonna have tens of millions of data points just from the GPS point data. So there's going to be many, many papers that come out of this, and we're going to learn more than we ever could have hoped to learn about eastern mallards. So it's really exciting time. So we want to understand what's going on with breeding, survival, and habitat usage, and kind of how all 3 of those things are linked. So, what are birds doing when they're on the landscape? How are they using that landscape and what's available? And how do their decisions and migration strategies affect survival and affect breeding and all these other things? And then we want to make comparisons because we're obviously seeing these differences between birds in the Northeast US and in Eastern Canada. We want to see if we can tease out some of the reasons that might explain why we're seeing population declines, or at least now it looks like it's stabilizing, but why we saw those declines in Northeast US mallards and versus Eastern Canada, where they seem to be doing just fine. So we're going to explore a lot of that, and we'll talk a lot more in detail about how these transmitters help us do that. And then we're also, there's a sister project associated with this that we're going to talk about where University of Saskatchewan is the lead on that. And they're marking hundreds and hundreds of black ducks with units. Black ducks are a species that historically saw a decline right about the time that mallards really took off. So there's a lot of theories and hypotheses that, mallards are excluding black ducks from habitat or pushing them to less optimal habitat and impacting them because they kind of overlap. They need the same habitats. They're very similar species. I mean, a black duck is basically a monochromatic mallard. They just don't have the plumage differences, or at least not to the same extent that mallards and mallards do between the males and the females. And a lot of this stuff, so like breeding, we can actually get at without ever going into the field. These birds are all over the landscape. They collect their data, and once a day, or actually twice a day, they connect and they actually send us, offload their data if they're within cell range. So some of these birds are going to go to Canada, they're going to go offline, and they could be offline for 6 months. And assuming they survive and they migrate back, they're going to offload 6 months worth of data when they come back. So some of them are gone for a while, but when they get back, we get all this information that we can actually infer whether or not that bird nested, whether or not it was successful, without ever going into the field. And I'll show you kind of some of the ways that we're able to do that. But another big aspect of this project is, again, linking back to breeding and survival and kind of full annual cycle, what they're doing. We can look for ways that maybe there are certain times of the year, based on how often they're feeding, where they're feeding, we can identify places where it appears that they're not getting their nutritional requirements. So, a bird that's typically foraging more, we're assuming it's foraging more because it's not feeding on as good of quality food as it should be. And we'll kind of get into how we know what a bird is doing in the field, because as I've described so far, all I've described is that we know where the birds are, but we can actually, with these transmitters, understand what they're doing when they're in those habitats from the transmitters. So we'll get into that in a little bit. Just to give you an idea kind of where we stand right now and kind of the huge spatial scale we're talking about. Like I said, it's pretty impressive how many. I think we have about 80 different banding locations already for this project, where we're marking them a really representative sample. We're not just marking them in one location and then they umbrella out. Right here, we've put out 640 GPS transmitters all the way from South Carolina. Put one out in Quebec there, and then a couple out here in Nova Scotia. I think that's still Nova Scotia. So we've really put them out everywhere, especially through PA, New York. PA and New York are really, for the Northeast US, that's where the majority of the mallards nest. So we kind of tried to portion them based on where they nest and where they winter, and then we put them out kind of proportional to that. Geolocators, as I said, are on a little plastic leg band, whereas the GPS transmitters are a backpack that is connected with an elastic harness to allow them to kind of grow and lose, like gain and lose weight throughout the year without impeding the bird too much. So some of the migration data, I try to map shorter time periods because it turns into spaghetti. The first year, this is just showing you the fall migration. And really the whole point of this is really just to show how important New York is to mallards, whether it's nesting or whether it's migration. You can see we are a major corridor. These birds are going way up onto James Bay, Polar Bear Park, other areas throughout Ontario. But the real core summering area is kind of here along the St. Lawrence River, all the way to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and then down through New York, Southern Ontario, and then we get some that get up into this area. But basically, it's New York and north. So this is just 1 year of data. This is only partial data. We're going to get tons and tons more, and you can take this data and do other things to make it a lot more easy to interpret. This is just really quick mapping. We're going to have 3 graduate students on this. So this is a really just quick snapshot of kind of some of the data that we're getting. So this is kind of a fun graphic that shows you what migration looks like. So this is each one of those points is an individual bird. If you look right here in the center, it's telling you what the date is. So this is September 5th we're at. You can see a little bit of movement, not much movement going on in August and September. There's a couple of those northern birds start to come down. You get some movements back north though, like there's no real big push yet. We're already into October, still no big pushes. And now you're starting to see more and more pushes as you get later into October. And then there's a good push the last couple of days of October, you get into November, you start to see more pushes, get to see mid-November, another big push. So basically every couple of days, there's a push of birds, coming into New York. Once you get to the beginning of December here, which is at where we're at now, most of these birds are getting pretty darn close to, as far as like new birds coming to New York, most of them are already in New York. Once you get to the end of December, movement almost stops throughout the entire flyway. Now, this is just 1 year data. Maybe next year will be different. We'll have different weather. You know, weather is a big driver of migration. There's a lot of cues that kind of trigger ducks to move. But weather's a big one, and these ducks just never moved. They were pretty much where they were going to be by mid-December. So really neat stuff. We're going to get a lot more information on migration timing. And then, like I said, we're looking at nesting. So this is really one of the main things that we're concerned about, because ultimately that's what drives populations. There's two things: survival, which we already get from banding data. We're looking at survival just because we have the opportunity to kind of fine tune when that mortality happens. But because the GPS, we know exactly when the bird dies. And then we're looking at nesting. So these are all birds. You can see in this picture here, you can see the transmitter through the brush. There's a hen sitting there on a nest. And mallards are really adaptable. They can nest almost anywhere. And, you know, this is your kind of real natural, this is kind of what you think of when you think of upland nesting ducks. Some people don't realize that mallards and most puddle ducks or dabbling ducks, most of them nest in grasslands, not in wetlands. They nest near wetlands, but they can be up to a mile away from a wetland and just be in a big grass field like that. This is a neat one in Ontario, where there was, it's actually sad, kind of, there was a hen that nested in this, that's actually a manure pit that had not been used recently, but you couldn't walk in there, like you would sink right through a human would, but it looks like really good habitat. The problem is it has a 6-foot concrete wall all the way around it, and there's no outlet. So this hen was actually successful. She hatched a brood, but then the brood couldn't get out. So that was really tough. So there's these kind of ecological traps. This is a bird in Pennsylvania. It was actually a New York bird. The bird migrated south in the springtime, which was kind of interesting. And then it nested down there. It nested right next to this bush, right next to this building. And it ended up hatching her nest. And then unfortunately, people started chasing her around, and her brood got separated from her, and they had to take the brood, and she flew into the building. So they had to take the brood to a rehabber. And so I guess just a word of caution to let wildlife be when they have young. And then here's a really neat one. This one actually nested inside this hollowed out tree, kind of up in the woods. It was a really kind of an odd spot for a duck to nest, but we have had a couple of these where they nest in like tree crevices, which is that's been a little bit surprising. But what we can do is each one of these transmitters has what's called an accelerometer in it. Accelerometer. There we go. In it. And what that is it tells you kind of the orientation of the transmitter. And do I have one here? I thought I had one sitting here. Unfortunately, I don't have a transmitter sitting here. But anyways, basically it tells you how the transmitter is sitting. So like if it's pointed up, down, side, in a 3-dimensional way. It also tells you how much it's moving. So it takes like a 10-second burst every 10 minutes, or 3-second burst every 10 minutes. So you get kind of a 3-second shot of how much and in which ways that transmitter is moving. And from that, we can actually know if it's feeding, if it's flying, if it's resting, if it's preening, and then if it's nesting. We can also do that between location data and from that movement data. And so this is another animation. This is a mallard from Virginia, I believe, that nested in just north of the Adirondacks, more towards the St. Lawrence, pretty close to the Canadian border. That blue box, you're going to see when I click the button, there's going to be a red dot that's bouncing all around. And what that red dot is the bird's location. And so its nest was right inside of that blue box. We actually went there and confirmed this nest. because we have to know what truth is. So we knew pretty well when these birds were nesting, but we went in on about 20 of the nests just to make sure that what we think is nesting and what looks like nesting is actually nesting. So it takes about 27 days for a bird to hatch a nest. So she's going back to the nest, spending most of the day there, but you see she takes breaks. She takes a couple hours of breaks every day. What we're learning through this is that they take probably more breaks than we thought, at least in the East. And then what happened there, sorry if you didn't see it, she walked away from the nest. And that's how we know that she was successful, actually, because if she had failed or a predator had taken the nest, she would have just flown away. You would have seen her flying all over the place. If you noticed, she kind of swam down here, went down to this other beaver pond, and then just bounced around here most of the time. Occasionally, she'll leave the brood, so you might get like one point that's far away. But pretty much she stayed with the brood ever since then. So really neat stuff. We have this for, a lot of birds at this point, and we're going to have hundreds and hundreds more that we're going to get this type of data from. And so we have all kinds of coding and things like that and computer learning that identifies these patterns in the data that the graduate student, the PhD student is developing right now, to identify these patterns and to pick out birds that are nesting and understand success. But we can also visually look at the data. And again, this is all super preliminary stuff. So none of this is to the be all end all of what we expect to see, but this is just from last year. And we had about 110 and actually it's more like 140 now, as birds came back. I made these graphs during the summertime. But nest success is about 20 to 22%, which is, and there isn't a huge difference, at least in year one, between Canada and the US. Birds that nested in both had pretty similar nest success. Let's see, so what else was there about this? What's really amazing, I think, to most folks is that the reality is most duck nests don't survive, and you don't need a lot to survive. So 22%, essentially 20 to 22% of eastern mallard duck nests in that first year anyways, actually made it to hatching. So this is two pictures of the same nest. So this was the nest on one day, and then they went back later and the nest had flooded and then the eggs had been taken. It's tough being a duck. One, they have about a 50% annual survival rate. They're not like humans or other animals. They have very low survival. So they have to be really successful, and they have to have a lot of ducklings to keep their population going. But good news is there's lots of them. As you can see, they have 8 to 10 eggs. So when they are successful, they can be really successful. If anyone's interested, so this is an ongoing study. We just had our first grad student started in January. We have a PhD student that's starting in September. The first student is a master's student at Brockport. But you can either take a picture of that, or you can follow that link to that survey or to that website. The website, it's not up to date right now, but basically it automatically updates every day once we get the code back working. We had a PhD student who actually dropped the program, unfortunately, just decided it wasn't for them. So they had made this website, but we'll get it back up and running very soon. And you can actually see in real time when ducks are migrating, so you can follow along in the spring. In the fall, we shut it down just because of hunting seasons. We don't want people targeting marked birds. Unfortunately, those are things we have to worry about just because of how people are. And these units are expensive. So we don't want to be like, if people shoot them just going out hunting, it's fine. It's not a big deal. That's to be expected, but we want to cut down on people targeting them. So that's mallards. I'm going to have to speed up because I'm going way too slow. Sorry. But that's the one I'm most involved in. So I feel like I have to spend the most time on it as one of the primary leads on that. This black duck project is a very large project as well. There's actually a bunch more cooperators that are listed here because they've added the central flyway. So they've added Ohio, Kentucky, who else? Tennessee, a number of kind of central flyway states, but very similar questions, very similar methods, but looking at black ducks. And as I said, so black ducks are a species that breeds a little bit farther north than mallards typically. They breed in the boreal of Canada, is really their primary breeding grounds. And like I said, they experienced some downturns for a long time. So they've been stable for about 20, 25 years or so. So they've been stable for a while, but there's still those concerns, especially as mallards are increasing in Canada. The concern is obviously as mallards increase, it could have negative impacts on black ducks. So we want to understand exactly what's going on and how they interact. So same type of thing, transmitter. This is a black duck, I think, in Connecticut. They're deploying over 600. In reality, it'll probably be like 800 because as birds die, we recover the units and you can actually put them out again because they're solar. Most of these we can, if they die in places with cell phone reception, we can recover them usually. It's usually, birds of prey and things like that that are killing them. So this is another animation of a nest. Let's see, where does she nest? She sets up shop at some point. It's looking like here. We'll see if it, or no, it's right there. That's where her nest is. So this one ends up nesting, and same type of thing. At a certain point, you're going to see it walk away from the nest once we get into June, and she's going to start spending time over here with her brood. So same types of things where they're looking at movements, wetland use, and nest success. She's also looking at mercury levels in ducks, and see that she just left, and then she's got her brood and she's going back and forth over here. So really neat stuff. Ilsa Griebel, these are almost all these ones on the Black Duck project are her slides. So I want to make sure I give her credit for this. This is not my stuff. She made this animation. The other ones I made for the mallard stuff. But these are all hers. She's a great grad student. She's going to really help us a lot and answer a lot of questions that we have. So this is, like I was mentioning, this is the accelerometer data. And when you graph it out, this is kind of what it looks like. So when a bird's feeding, this is the X, Y, and Z of kind of how that transmitter is oriented. And you can see it's moving around a little bit when it's feeding. When it's resting, it's almost stationary. And then when it's flying, it's really obvious because it's just, it's moving a lot. So what's really neat about these transmitters, again, because we're getting this data every 10 minutes, it's not like most observational studies we've done. So we've done a lot of studies on ducks and other birds, and we call them activity budgets, where you take out a spotting scope, you look at a flock of birds, you pick out a single bird, a random bird from the flock, and you sit there and every 10 seconds you say what it's doing. And so you sit there and you create a tally and you can understand, okay, this bird in this area, in this habitat for 15 minutes, this is what it was doing. And that's great. That's really neat information, really useful. But you're getting a 15-minute picture of what it's doing in that specific habitat. With this, we're following a bird for an entire year, all day, every day, throughout the entire annual cycle, no matter where it goes. So just an incredible opportunity that we've never had before. The data we get is a little bit more coarse, but what she actually has to do, and what we've already done, is we video birds with transmitters and sync up the time between the camera and the data that we're collecting. And then we can actually use computer learning to identify, all right, this is what it looks like when it's feeding. And we crank up, like, basically we take continuous data rather than once every 10 minutes. And we can look at that data and see, okay, this is what it looks like when they're feeding. This is what it looks like when they're standing there. So we can identify these patterns and verify them. As I said, we pair this with location data, but right here, this is kind of what it looks like when you look at how much they're moving. And then all of a sudden you see those movements just drop off to almost nothing. It'll just, and that's because she's sitting on a nest, short breaks. So we can get at nesting attempts, full-term incubation, and brood rearing. The one thing we're struggling right now is nesting attempts. We can definitely pick up when a duck is incubating, but for about 10 days before they incubate, they're laying one egg a day. But the problem is they only stop at the nest, and it might only be for 30 minutes. So we might not even get a point because we're only taking a point every hour. And she might go to the nest and leave and like drop an egg and leave before we even get a point on her there. So it's been a little challenging to pick up egg laying, but we're hopeful we can figure out some way or some pattern we can pick up on. So what that comes down to is having a bunch of known nesting birds where we know what they look like once they're actually incubating, and then start looking for patterns before that. So This is where it starts, when you really get into how everything's interconnected. And this is what a lot of these PhD students are going to be trying to tease apart, because there's so many different variables that all ultimately lead to reproductive success. It could be winter severity, precipitation, all these different things, habitat quality, and how do those all feed in, the different migration strategies, waiting until later, arriving early and risking bad weather. All these different things can have different impacts on your ultimate success of nesting. So we want to understand how they all play together, and that's really what this is trying to link, that full annual cycle. How do all of their decisions in a given year, what describes a productive black duck? So real quick, we'll just show you a couple animation. So this is spring migration, so March 1st to May 31st. You can see you still got some birds going south. They're kind of just bouncing around. Then birds are starting to go north. We're into March 25th. Pretty stationary. So just so you know, our duck surveys start about April 15th in New York. So we're doing surveys, and as you can see, birds are still moving a lot for black ducks. I will say our duck surveys are really designed to count mallards. They're not designed to count black ducks. They're not designed to count anything else. They're timed for mallards. So that's not surprising, but you can see these black ducks are going much farther north, much later, because these areas are still frozen. Like once you get up here into Angava, I mean, it could be mid-June before those actually thaw. So these birds are probably right on the ice line up here, even in late May. But you can see how much farther they're going into Canada, and going a lot more further east. If you remember from those mallards, a lot of them were kind of going north and west. So going a totally different direction. In the fall, kind of returning from those breeding grounds, same kind of timing as mallards. That was kind of a neat movement. I don't know if you saw that. This one over here from Labrador came down and then turned around halfway over the water. So just decided that wasn't a good wind for it. And so these are all those migration strategy questions, and some neat papers I think are going to come out of that, kind of birds that make really big movements and then return right back to where they started. So just these movements that kind of don't make sense to us, like, trying to understand why did they make that movement. And it might be that migration isn't as costly as we think it is. It seems like it's costly when you're flying 1,000 miles, but maybe they're not resource limited at that time of year. Ducks can put on weight really quickly. They can lose weight really quickly. So all neat stuff. This is basically the proportion of time spent in these 4 activities for every single day throughout the calendar year. So she's going to do this for every single bird in the study. So this is like, the amount of data is really incredible. I mean, you're probably looking at 100 million points for this activity budget data. And you can see, so this is when she was sitting on a nest, the stationary time, stationary. Most of the time she's stationary during that time of the year. When she's migrating or getting ready to migrate, you see this proportion of time spent feeding jumps way up, and jumps up here again in like April time. So this is where, you can tie all this stuff back together. So really neat stuff. Really looking forward to some of the data she's going to get. All right, so those are 2 big duck studies that we're doing. I mean, they're just gigantic projects. We're talking, a couple $1 million in those 2 studies between all the states, and just trying to understand these species, because they are hunted species. They are enjoyed by birders. We take it very seriously that we need to make sure we're managing them responsibly and understand population dynamics. So now we're going to move on to geese. Atlantic population, I shouldn't say AP geese, should say Atlantic population Canada geese. So geese, if you don't know, a goose is not a goose. There's a lot of different kinds of geese, even ones that look identical. So Canada geese we manage by population, because the populations are very different biologically, and how they respond to harvest are all very different. So we have these migratory populations, and we have 2 in New York that come through. We have Atlantic population, we have North Atlantic population. The North Atlantic population kind of sticks to Long Island. Atlantic population is basically the rest of the state. And then we have resident population geese. Your resident population geese are the ones that everyone has a problem with, or a lot of people have a problem with, because they're the ones that you're stepping in their droppings everywhere, and that are nesting all around and attacking people that bike by their nest. So those ones are super productive. They are always successful. We had broods in Pennsylvania in the first week of February this year. I mean, just incredibly early, like, as soon as it starts getting warm, I mean, they're basically a chicken. They can just start laying eggs and start nesting. Probably can have 2 broods. I think we've only documented that 1 or 2 times, but they're really successful. They start breeding earlier. They start breeding at like 3 years, 2 or 3 years, have larger clutches, number of eggs. And their nest success is super high because they don't have a lot of predators. Then you got these Arctic nesting geese or subarctic nesting geese, these Atlantic population and North Atlantic population. Their populations are much, much smaller. Resident population geese, we have 375,000 breeding in New York alone. North Atlantic population, we only have about 200,000 breeding pairs, so about 400,000, 300,000. We have about 150,000. So we have about 300,000 of these in the entire flyway. So much smaller population, much larger area where they breed. And they're very boom and bust. They have years where they have great productivity. And then they have years like 2018. It was still frozen until the end of June up there. So the birds arrive so late, they actually don't even have time to successfully nest. So they went up there banding. They only encountered about 30 juveniles out of the thousands of birds that they banded. And of those, probably none of those were going to survive because they weren't big enough. And before things start freezing up, they probably weren't going to be able to get out. So that's what makes them really susceptible. And this frustrates hunters a lot because, they see a goose and a goose, they all look the same. So they don't understand why we have a 30-day season throughout much of the season, or throughout much of the fall in upstate New York right now. And it's because back here in the late 90s, we actually had a moratorium on hunting Canada geese. I mean, they were pretty rare at that point. That was before resident geese really took off. And we got down to less than 50,000 AP geese. And it was a combination of 2 things. Really, what drives their population is productivity. When they have poor productivity, their population can tank really quickly, especially when you pair it with harvest. Ducks, there isn't a really strong relationship between harvest and populations and survival. With Arctic nesting geese, they're kind of a whole different breed. There's a very strong and obvious link between the 2. So we regulate these really closely. We really understand their population. There was a lot of research done back in the 90s during all these moratoriums and really restrictive seasons. But as you can see, for a long time, we were floating along pretty good. And then we hit about a 10-year period of really poor productivity. So what happened was we had poor productivity throughout this whole period, and these birds can handle 1 or 2 years, poor productivity, not a big deal. They're a long-lived species. Harvest rates are still pretty low on these birds, and they have high survival, but productivity is so low. Eventually, if you keep having poor productivity, you start to see about 2011, it started a little bit of a decline, and it kind of bounces as it goes down. And then it started to really tank. And this is when we went back to 30-day seasons and a 1 bird bag limit, really restrictive. And we're starting to come out of that right now. We're going back to more liberal seasons next year because the population is rebounded, and we can sustain that again. But at the same time, we're trying to reduce the impacts of all these resident geese. So what we want to understand is really when exactly are these birds here? Where exactly are they? And then also we'll probably look at a lot of those breeding metrics, same things we're doing with ducks with this data, because we'll have the data. We're putting these neck collars on. These neck collars are actually a lot bigger batteries. They have 3 solar arrays that are really big. So they can give us data actually every 5 minutes. We're getting data from these. So we get a location every 5 minutes, which is really, multiplying that data many, many times for what we're getting from mallards. Same type of accelerometer data. And we're going to be marking about 500 of these. Did I show a map of where these are? I did not show a map of where these are. I think I have it. Well, you'll see it when I show the map. I can just point it out. But again, large collaborative research project. We try not to do these things alone. Work together, leverage funding between a number of different entities to get the most out of the research and really increase sample sizes. One of the biggest struggles with wildlife science is that we're often dealing with really small sample sizes. My graduate work was based on 12 GPS transmitters and common mergansers, and that was very expensive at the time when I did that. But these projects, we have these huge sample sizes, so we really powerful stuff. So some of the things we're trying to understand are migration routes. This is a species that we've done some GPS telemetry, some neck collar work, because there's a lot of native or Inuit, Cree communities that really use these populations for subsistence harvest and for things like that. So we want to be cognizant of that. And so we want to make sure we're not having impacts on these populations, because we're going to have Canada geese in New York no matter what, but these migratory populations are susceptible, like I said, to overharvest. So trying to find out, we have these resident goose, so that's what RP stands for, zones, where we, based on banding data, have kind of said these migratory birds don't go here. So we've carved out these zones where we can have more liberal opportunity to try to suppress the resident goose populations and mitigate the impacts they're having through regulated hunting rather than using nuisance birds or permits and roundups and stuff like that. But we want to make sure that our zones are correctly defined. We want to understand when they're coming through, when there's opportunity maybe for more hunting for resident geese, or where maybe we need to be more restrictive because maybe there's more of these AP birds coming through certain areas that we're not picking up in the banding data. And then, like I said, we'll look at breeding information. We want to make sure we're going to mark some birds on the wintering grounds and make sure that they go back to places we expect them to go back to, because when we're doing our surveys, we need to know that we're surveying the right areas, because maybe it's not declines that we're experiencing. Maybe it's just shifts where they're going somewhere different. Unlikely, but we need to make sure that that's not happening. We also have limits on what days your season can start throughout the flyway, trying to, again, allow birds to pass through certain areas without being harvested. But we don't really know if those dates are meaningful, and are they the right dates, and are we really saving the correct birds? So this project just started this year, kind of neat. So you can see they breed all throughout up here, mostly tied to these coastal areas. This is where we band them with helicopters. Pretty neat stuff. Fly around in a helicopter, round them up when they're flightless. And then they fly. And again, New York, as I mentioned, for most of these species, New York's a really important state. You can see how many of these birds in September. We have a September season that's supposed to target resident Canada geese that runs until September 25th every year. We know that occasionally they arrive a little bit early. This year was a real anomaly in that they arrived 2 days earlier than we would have anticipated, and a large number of them. And what's really interesting is when you start pairing this with weather data, we can see that, as we would expect, when you get these really strong, this is winds graphics, and we had about like 20 to 30 mile an hour sustained northwest winds. And these birds just rode that down. So it just lined up with a perfect storm of weather to where it was really conducive to migration. And you can kind of see that they jumped down into New York. So we're going to learn a lot more, but pretty neat. Oh, why did that not play? Well, maybe that one's not going to play. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is where they were on the wintering grounds. This was January 1st. This one starts. And what's really neat is how quickly and how many come into New York State in the springtime. So we used to have a season that went February 28th to March 10th in our resident goose zones, trying to make sure, give more opportunity to hunt resident geese. And we had some indication from banding data that maybe we were shooting too many of these birds as they arrived in early years. So this is March 3rd, and look how many are already in New York. Now, this is an AP zone, so this wouldn't have been open, but all these areas down here are open, and about 75% of the birds moved through New York State and would have been available for harvest this year had we still had that season. So this is the type of data that we can get that we get a little bit of an indication from banding data, but this is a lot more precise information. So we can really refine this. And these transmitters will last 2-3 years. So, and we're going to have a lot more of them over the course of the study. So we're going to get a lot of data on the migration of these birds. So that's kind of how that data is going to be used now. Then we have North Atlantic. So NAP is North Atlantic. So these birds are over by Labrador, New Brunswick, Newfoundland. There's the one I was looking for. So kind of this area here, it's not a great graphic, but that's where these birds are. They nest in areas that are really hard to capture them. So where I showed you before, that's mostly open space, and you can use helicopters. We go up there every year. We actually band about 3,000 of the AP geese on their breeding grounds. That's how we monitor their population and productivity, things like that. With these birds, they're nesting in forested areas, so it's not easy to just use a helicopter. So in that open landscape, tundra landscape, you can drop a person with a net or like a corral essentially, and then the helicopter goes around and rounds them up like a sheepdog and drives them into the net, just flying low and towards them slowly, and they'll just walk right into the pen, and then you put a band on them and let them go because they're flightless that time of year for about 2 weeks. With these birds, it's not really possible. There aren't a lot of roads in a lot of these areas. You just can't access the birds. So we have a hard time monitoring these populations, but just like the AP geese, their populations are pretty small. So we want to be careful with this. I mean, we're only talking about 50,000 breeding pairs. We do have an aerial survey. You can see those lines here. Those are transect surveys. So we do have a good estimate of how many there are, but we just don't get all the banding data to understand harvest relationships. We don't understand survival and things like that we would typically plug into a population model to understand the demographics of that population. So we're looking for ways we can do that without going to them on the breeding grounds. So there's some work being done. This one is completely outside of New York State. We really, although it affects New York State because of Long Island, this work is mostly funded by Northeast US states and Eastern Canada and the Maritimes. There's a bunch of people from Maine in these photos. They going up to Prince Edward Island, and they put GPS transmitters, and then they're also experimenting with putting nanotags. So nanotags is this little tiny transmitter that's on that bird's back. And what that is a little radio transmitter. And there are tower arrays all up and down the coast that capture any bird. There's a code that is transmitting. And if it flies within a certain distance of these towers, those towers will record them. And the bird's still alive in that case. So we're trying to use this as a surrogate for banding, because typically with banding, you need to band a whole bunch of birds because you need to get hunter recoveries and birds that are found dead and just reports of those birds and encounters of those birds to get any information, or else you get nothing. With these, you don't actually need to capture the bird again. It just needs to still be alive because it'll fly by one of these towers and you can get that information. So kind of a novel approach. You can see we use a lot of different ways to try to get the information that we need out of these birds, and different technologies that really help wildlife science and help us appropriately manage these birds to make sure that we're meeting our legal mandates and making sure we're not having a negative impact on the populations. I'm going to start going faster just because I know I'm running out of time, so I apologize. I went a little too far into the details of some. Another big telemetry project and geolocator project. This is a project that started way back in 2018. There have been a couple graduate students. If you get our conservationist magazine, our PhD student right now, this past summer, she wrote an article, I think in the August issue, Lindsay Carlson is her name, on how we're using GPS transmitters on Atlantic Brant. So check it out if you're interested. There's also a digital copy on our, if you search for the Conservationist magazine, you can find this in the August issue. So for this, Atlantic Brant are really interesting. Get a couple photos here. The ones on the left are from me when I went up to Baffin Island, which is way up in the Arctic, middle of nowhere, probably 300 miles from the closest human. Where our base camp was, polar bears, all kinds of neat stuff, but just this open tundra like moonscape. And we go out there and we band these and snow geese. And these, you can see they have, these pictures are really pixelated for some reason. I don't know why, but we put color lag bands on, we put transmitters, we put geolocators on these little red bands. So that's how we catch them up north, the same way where you're using helicopters and corralling birds that can't fly. And then on the wintering grounds, we use these large rocket nets. I believe this is from New York. Yeah, this is one of our captures down on Long Island. So large collaborative effort between Canadian Wildlife Service, New York State DEC, and New Jersey and University of Saskatchewan again. So right now we have a graduate student, Lindsay Carlson. She's a PhD student at University of Saskatchewan. She's looking at those full annual cycle, but she's also looking particularly her funding for her actual project. We funded all the GPS transmitters and stuff like that between New Jersey, CWS, and New York. But Niskamoon, a Cree community along the James Bay, is actually paying for her because they're very interested in how Brant are using the James Bay. There's a lot of hydroelectric power on almost every single one of the rivers that feed into it, into the James Bay on the east side, and it causes sedimentation, which causes impacts to eelgrass, which is the primary food of Atlantic Brant along migration. And so they want to look at where the birds are feeding in relation to what's available. So she's doing a lot of on the ground work. We have 250 birds with transmitters, which is still a huge sample size, multiple years of data on some of those. And so that's going to be really interesting work. Just some graphs on, or some maps on some of these migration routes. So this is Baffin Island, where we were banding them when I was describing when I went up there and did that. We also banned them on Southampton Island. And then there's this Prince Charles Island, which is actually where most of these birds end up summering. A lot of them end up there. And again, New York, ground zero for a lot of these birds. 80% of the population winters between Cape May, New Jersey, and Nassau County in New York. So very small population. We highly regulate this species because it is a small, there's only about 120,000 of these birds, and that's their entire population. It's not like AP geese where, we define a population, but there's a lot of geese. There's going to be Canada geese no matter what. Atlantic Brant, like that is the entire population. So we really regulate this species and do a lot of work. As part of this project, this is where I'll dig in a little bit on geolocators and how we use that technology. So this is Leanne Neufeld. She's funded by Canadian Wildlife Service and the University of Manitoba, and DC, New Jersey, and CWS put a lot of these markers on, but she did a lot of the data analysis. So this is a geolocator band. It's a plastic band with a code on it. And then on the other side is this small plastic device that looks like a fat nickel. Essentially is all it is, a little clear device that's zip tied to the side of the band. I thought I had a photo in there, but I don't. So because they're breeding in the middle of nowhere, these aren't places that you can just go to during the breeding season. Like I said, we were in a base camp that is 200 or 300 miles from the closest people, and it's really inaccessible. It's still cold during the middle of the summer. I think the water was like 34 degrees in August when we're banding up there. So we're using these geolocators as a check on the GPS data, because whenever you put a marker on a bird, you want to understand that it's not impacting the bird's movements, and everything you're inferring from that data, make sure it's not biased. So we put these geolocators on that don't give us quite as precise of information, but the question is, does it still give us the same results? Are they leaving at about the same time? Are they migrating to the same places? So we put 800 of these devices out to look at where they're going. So we use this to look at spring migration timing, staging locations, nesting propensity, and compare it to the GPS transmitters. So we deployed these units all over the place. As you can see, we put them out on Baffin Island, we put them out on Southampton Island, and then we put them out in New York and New Jersey between 2018 and 2021. As I said, these devices don't remote download. We need a hunter to shoot them and recover, or we need to recapture the bird. There's two ways we get it back. Either we catch that bird again, or a hunter harvests one and then calls it in and then sends us the device, which most hunters are very happy to do. Oh, there we go. I do have a picture. So this is what a geolocator looks like. It's just zip tied to the side of that band. Obviously something small that's on its leg like that, probably not going to have an impact on the bird, whereas something like a backpack transmitter, it might. and we want to make sure that it's not, and that we're getting good data. So this is the data. This is actually 3 full years of data from one of these devices. What you see on this top line is sunrise. The bottom line is sunset, darkness, lightness. You can see there's like periods of darkness during the day. That's when a bird just lays down or something when it's resting. So the transmitter goes dark because it's on its leg. And then what's really neat is you can visually kind of see it here. First year, this bird might have tried to nest for like a day or two, and then it failed. Second year, it very clearly nested, and I think this one, it was successful this year. Then third year, it started to nest, and then it failed. And the reason you know it's nesting is up there, you can see how short the day or the night is. It's actually almost full. I mean, it's in the Arctic Circle where the camp is. So this bird must not have quite been to the Arctic Circle because it did still have sunrise and sunset. But then you can see there's all these dark periods, and that's just because the bird's sitting on a nest. The other thing I'll point out about this data is you see where these jumps happen, where all of a sudden the day gets much shorter or much longer. That's migration that's happening. So that's how we're estimating location, because obviously the change in sunrise and sunset is not abrupt anywhere. This is a very slow a couple minutes per day. And then when you see these big jumps, it's because that bird migrated. This is kind of showing the wintering locations of these birds. This is just a single point representing each bird. And like you can see, all these points are kind of between New York and New Jersey. You can see there's a lot more uncertainty. Birds are not wintering out in the middle of the open ocean. That's just error in the location data, but it's somewhere in here. It's about 150 kilometers is about the accuracy of these devices. See the timing of when they leave. They're leaving, they get up here in about June. They're getting on these staging grounds. This is James Bay. Really the western side is where they spend a lot of their time. And so we get all this data. Again, I know I'm running out of time, so I don't want to spend too much time. We can get breeding propensity from this data. So for a brant, they only need to nest for about 22 days. Their breeding window is much shorter. They're another boom and bust. So we actually every fall monitor juveniles, because juveniles actually have different plumage. You can just look at flocks and you can see how many juveniles are in the flocks. They have a bunch of buff feathers on their wings that adults don't have. So you can see 2018 was a terrible year, and we had not great nest success. And then in other years it was a little bit better, and you see better nest success. So that's the kind of information we're trying to get. Mean initiation date. This is why these birds are boom and bust, because of how harsh of conditions where they nest. They don't even start nesting until the end of June, and they have to nest for 22 days, and then those juvenile birds have to fledge and be able to fly by about September. They need to be out of there because that's when it freezes again. So really short window. When things freeze or thaw late, they can miss an entire breeding season. So the good news from all this is that the data from GPS transmitters and the data from geolocators are almost identical. They line up almost perfectly. So really great stuff, really important that we're able to confirm that we're not affecting migration timing. So we can use all that fine scale data from the GPS data. And in some cases, when our questions don't require that really fine data, what this tells us is this is possibly another way to get that data without spending nearly as much money to get that. These are what we call home range maps. So it's just putting outside bounds on where the majority of the points are. So this is 50% of the points are within the yellow, 80% within the orange, and 90% within the red. And so geolocator data on the left, GPS transmitters that are much more finer scale. You can see they really key in on where those birds are, but generally it's telling you the same thing. So that's all really encouraging stuff. I'm going to probably skip the contaminant stuff, I guess, just to let you know. I'm going to do it really quick. New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Connecticut. We got a bunch of hunter harvested birds from a representative sample of areas. That's what all these hexagons are. We randomized the sample to try with migratory birds. It's a little bit hard to get a representative sample of all ducks in the flyway. So we looked at mallards, black ducks, green-winged teal, wood ducks, looked at all the legacy contaminants. So, your mercury, dioxins, things like that. And then we're also looking at, I'm sure you've probably seen it in the news, there's a lot of questions about PFOAs and these other kind of newer contaminants that we're concerned about. So ducks and geese, most of the dabbling ducks that people commonly consume are thought to be pretty low in contaminant levels for those legacy contaminants. But they also feed in a lot of areas that might actually make them susceptible to these newer concerns like PFOAs. So we're going to look at their loads and understand how it's potentially affecting the waterfowl health and also how it affects human health for people who consume these birds. So all those points are where we collected birds. And then lastly, sorry, I know I ran long. I'm going to end it with an upland game bird and totally different technologies. But so grouse, if you spend a bunch of time outdoors, you might notice that you might not hear as many grouse as you used to. Grouse indices have declined pretty significantly in New York and in many areas throughout the Northeast United States, basically south of Maine. We're experiencing really big declines in grouse numbers. Rough grouse we're talking about here, not spruce grouse. So this is eBird, has some really neat trends data. This is new data that they're using citizen science to look at trends through time. They have a lot of ways to correct the biases in this data, but all this red means is that you're seeing statistically significant decline. So, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, especially Pennsylvania, southern reaches, you're seeing these declines in grouse and still trying to kind of understand why. The leading kind of hypothesis is that it has to do with recruitment and potentially with risks from West Nile virus. So there's been a lot of research done in PA, and we're going to be doing some new research in New York with SUNY ESF and Cynthia Downs, who's an animal physiologist there. And so we're going to be putting this picture here in the top right is a passive recording device. And so we're going to use that to understand occupancy of grouse, or grouse in those habitats. So it'll be on every day for 2 months and listening for drumming grouse essentially in the springtime. And then we're going to pair that with a bunch of mosquito trapping to understand our mosquitoes that feed on birds in those areas. And then we can do a lot of exploring relationships between habitat characteristics, elevation, soil permeability, to understand how we can prioritize habitat, because you can build the best habitat in the world. If it's a disease sink where the birds are just, the young just aren't surviving, because young are the ones that are most susceptible to West Nile virus, more so than the adults. So you could build great habitat, attract a bunch of grouse, but that population is still going to go extinct because they're dying from disease. So we want to find places where we can invest in young forest to benefit grouse in areas where we can have the greatest impact. So right now we have, based on the information from Pennsylvania, a grouse priority area siting tool, which all that is it highlights areas of the state that have better habitat or have better conditions, that if you put the right habitat on the ground, you could have grouse persist in those areas. It's where are grouse going to persist if they have habitat, not where are grouse right now, or where is the habitat for grouse right now. It's really for siting and selecting areas where you want to put habitat. But that's all based on information from Pennsylvania. We have 3 subspecies of grouse. We have totally different mosquito populations up here. So we don't know how that translates to New York and whether or not using information from Pennsylvania makes sense. So we're going to be doing all this work with ESF, update some extinction probability analyses from the breeding bird atlas that was done, the last breeding bird atlas, and hopefully learn a lot about grouse population dynamics in the process. So implications, again, a lot of habitat management. We're spending a lot of money trying to put good habitat on the ground for whippoorwills, for grouse, for all these different species that really rely on these early successional habitats. So that is what we're kind of up to. And again, I think I've said it a couple times now, but apologize for going a little bit long and getting into the weeds a couple times. But a lot of different research projects we have going on right now, and a lot of great work that should be getting out there pretty soon in the scientific literature. So I'm happy to take any questions you guys might have had. I know I went through a lot of stuff in a lot of detail. So
that was fascinating, Josh, just really amazing. Maybe if you stop sharing screen and people can unmute themselves to ask some questions. You can either just unmute and speak up or raise your hand.
Yeah, Justin, one I was interested in, growing up in Michigan, our goose hunting season basically ran from September 1st to end of January, and it was basically as many as you could take. I've always wondered why it's so different in New York, but that's a great explanation.
So for what was that? That was for grouse?
No, for geese.
Oh, for geese. Yeah. Yeah, and the Central Flyway takes a very different approach than the Atlantic Flyway. I'll be honest, we're a lot more conservative. We like to think of it as we're being good neighbors, because we could have really liberal seasons. We're always going to have geese in New York, in Pennsylvania, and all these states that have a lot of resident geese. But who's not going to have a lot of geese are a lot of these Cree communities where they might not have any geese. We're never going to eliminate them with recreational hunting, but we could create a situation where they're very, very low because of our harvest. And so
it's very interesting.
Work together.
So Josh, I wanted to ask, I wasn't clear on these three populations of Canadian geese that all look alike to me. Is this all one species and these are subspecies? And are people like you can tell the difference between the resident population and the North Atlantic, or?
So I can, if you give me a pair of calipers and take measurements, and we can be about 85, 90% sure based on those measurements for most birds. So they are a little bit like the migratory geese are a little bit smaller in general. Our geese are larger. So their head's a little bit bigger, their legs a little bit bigger. There's a bunch of different measurements that we take that can help us identify them. That's how we identify them on the wintering grounds to mark them. We'll see how good we are at doing that because they all have GPS transmitters. If they don't migrate to northern Canada, then we know we got the wrong one. Like we had two in that map. I don't know if you noticed that went over to Chicago. We don't know if those are the right one.
So is there like aside from the fact that the resident ones stay and are such a nuisance, is their behavior different? Like when they are, is one of them more impactful on the habitat or the environment, or?
So I mean, geese are geese, no matter what they're doing. They're out there, they're feeding in fields. I think it depends on what you say. When you say impacts, resident geese, the reason they're such a problem is because of the habitats that they use. They're long-lived species. They learned how to avoid pressure, and they are really effective at using these urban landscapes. Chicago's done a lot of research with telemetry. They have birds that nest on top of buildings. It's actually really common, even in Pennsylvania, and I'm sure in New York. But they're having a lot of birds in Pennsylvania. They're doing a resident Canada goose study, and they have birds that are regularly roosting on top of buildings on like flat roofs. They just go land on them. So I mean, they really are an interesting adaptable bird, but they are very different. Like I said, pretty much every part of their annual life history is very different. They're just way more productive in every way, shape, and form. They nest successfully more often. They have more young make it to adulthood. They survive at a greater rate annually because they're not exposed to as much risk. One of the things I'm really interested in, I think some of the Chicago work has looked at this, but when you're a migrating bird, you're also more susceptible because you're in new areas all the time. Resident goose that's not going very far, it knows the landscape really well. It knows where it's likely to get shot at and where it's not going to get shot at. Whereas a bird that just migrated from, the subarctic, it's just arriving and has no idea. It's going to different fields all the time. And every time it's kind of prospecting, it's exposing itself to risk. So I think that's in general why they're more susceptible. We have a lot of impacts from migratory geese as well, especially like on Long Island with North Atlantic population geese, just because they're using these very specific ag fields that, they can remove all the cover crops and cause a lot of issues. But as far as your question about species, they're all the same. Well, there's two species. There's cackling geese, which we don't really get many of in New York. Like when you get a cackling goose in New York, it's usually on a rare bird alert. because a lot of people mistake cackling or small Canada geese for cackling geese. Cackling geese are much, much smaller. They're hardly bigger than a mallard, a couple pounds. But there are actually, I think, 11 recognized subspecies of Canada geese and cackling geese, 4 cacklers, and I think there's 7 or 8 Canada geese throughout North America, not in the East. In the East, we have 3. But populations are then a different layer that we use for management that isn't necessarily connected to subspecies. So it gets pretty complicated with Canada geese. They're kind of a bear of speciation and nomenclature, and how we identify them. So it's very nuanced and confusing. It's a really difficult thing to explain to the public, especially hunters that are just frustrated because don't understand the differences. And like I said, they're very different, even though they look the same. So
Interesting.
I'm curious if you put a GPS on humans migrating down to Florida in the winter and back. But anyway, here's a question. How many miles does a typical mallard duck move per year?
Good question. I don't know the answer yet. It's highly variable. What we saw in the first year is kind of a latitudinal gradient. So the birds that wintered farther north went very short distances. I didn't have it in there, but like we have maps per state that we marked them in to show where they went. Birds from Maine pretty much didn't go anywhere. Birds from New York, most of them didn't go anywhere, but about maybe 20-30% of them went to Canada. The rest of them stayed local. And obviously, some of that is just might have been the birds that we marked, but we had some that we had 8 birds that we marked near like Skaneateles, and they all stayed within a 20-mile buffer of Skaneateles.
No, but you even showed the daily mallard, the mallard's flying away from her nest every day. I saw 30-50-mile commutes, it looked like.
No, it might have looked like that. No, daily movements. So daily from the nest. She's only going.
It was going all the way from New York to Vermont. It looked on a couple of those nesting.
Sorry, those weren't nesting. Those were just fall migration. So that was.
But you did show some figures of. She was making daily. It looked like she was making intermittent trips away from the nest, but going back to the nest.
Okay, so but she was never going more than a mile. She was going about a mile is about as far as they go. It just might have been poorly mapped. Those maps aren't great.
Okay. I misread the maps. The maps look like they covered a multi-state domain. Okay.
Okay. Yeah, no, they all the birds that we had that nested were all pretty close. We did have some really neat movements. Like we had a bird from New York. Again, when we think of migration, we're thinking fall and spring, and that's just typically what we're thinking about. But we had a bird from like the Herkimer area that flew to like the Rutland area of Vermont in June, nested, failed after about 15 days. The nest got depredated. And then 10 days later, she flew right back to where she was in Herkimer and never moved again the rest of the year. So just really interesting movements. So her migration and all of her movements were done by the end of June. So really neat stuff like that. We've seen a bunch of birds that have reverse migrated, not a bunch of birds, a handful of birds out of hundreds that are marked. Seems like a lot when you see a bunch or like a handful of them move, but like we had a bird from Western New York that went down to the southeast corner or southwest corner of Pennsylvania and nest. Just interesting movements like that. You always get stuff like that with this telemetry data that just kind of defies what we commonly expect to happen.
Any other questions? Wow. Well, Josh, thank you so much. It was just, Mike's got one. Or is that, that's a clapping hand, I think. I thought that was a hand up for a question. So yeah, really excellent. I'm sorry for I think a lot of people are going to be watching the recording because I'm sorry about the link mess up, but anyway, it is recorded and I'll probably just watch it again.
Well, thanks for having me.
Okay, so next month, I am hoping for Landis Arboretum, but they haven't completely confirmed. They're still checking who's available to talk. So that will be April 17th, and that will be our last for the spring. We'll take a break in the summer and start again in the fall with the speaker series. So, all right, well, thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. It's great.
Can't find the recording.